I'd like to begin by asking you, how did you become interested in aviation?
I think most boys, as they grew up in the 1920s, 1930s, were pretty hooked on aviation, built model airplanes, and thought about flying. Lindbergh was my boy hero, and I had his picture on the wall of my bedroom, and I think all of my generation was pretty much pointed in that direction. In 1935 and 36, I was working at the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Santa Monica, California. I was timekeeper on the graveyard shift, and I saw all those airplanes rolling out of there, and I thought to myself, somebody's got to be learning to fly those things. So I wrote to the Secretary of Navy and the Secretary of War and said, how do you get to be an aviator? And they both sent me application blanks to their flying cadet programs, and the Army responded first. The day I soloed at Randolph Field in February of '37, I got a letter from the Navy telling me to report to San Diego for my physical. By then it was too late, so I tell my Navy friends it's only because there was some incompetent Navy clerk in Washington that mishandled my application blank, or I'd have been flying off of flat tops. On my solo flight, we were flying out of Cade Field, which is a little associated field outside of Randolph. And I reached the point where my instructor climbed out and said, okay, kid, take it around. And boy, that front cockpit looked awful empty. But I got it off the ground and was very proud of myself, and put it into a box pattern and checked the T very carefully to make sure that I was coming in properly. And there was a little bit of a crosswind. And I came around and came in and made what I thought was a pretty good touchdown. I got a little bit of a crosswind and I handled it pretty well. Had 3 pops on the wheels just fine, and I was rolling out. All of a sudden there was a lot of noise, and somebody, a student officer, Lieutenant Meany, came sliding in sideways. He hadn't corrected for the crosswind and slid across my head. His wheels actually went across either side of my head, and his prop chopped through the front cockpit where the instructor had just climbed out of. And he went over, and my airplane was pretty well chopped up and came to a sudden halt. And his airplane landed and turned upside down. So I saw Meany hanging upside down from his parachute from his waist belt. And I thought, oh, he was probably dead. I'd never seen one of these great, big, beautiful airplanes all busted up before. So I jumped out of that rear cockpit and I unfastened my safety belt, but I still had my parachute fastened to me. And I hadn't unsnapped the Gosport earpieces through which the instructor could yell at you. We didn't have a electrical interphone then. And my feet got about 2 feet off the ground, and they got pulled up short by this Gosport and spilled me all around the ground in my parachute. And Meany thought he'd killed me. He unfastened his safety belt and dropped out on his head and pretty near broke his neck, trying to get to each other to help. And by that time, the instructors all came running out of the stage house. And my instructor said, well, kid, says, I think I picked just about, he looked at the front cockpit and said, I think I picked about the right time to let you solo. The front cockpit was just cut to ribbons.
Could you tell me what life was like in the Army Air Corps before the start of World War II?
It was a pretty small Air Force. There were 2 attack groups, 3 fighter groups, and about 3 bomb groups, and that was the Air Force. And there wasn't a guy in the Air Force that the old-timers didn't know. It was a pretty casual and a pretty comfortable and a very warm, close-knit bunch of guys. Of course, it wasn't the Air Force then, it was the Army Air Corps. And they were pretty much on the defensive, too, against the ground-pounding Army, because the ground Army didn't always think the highest of their flyboys. I remember Hugh McCaffrey was our squadron commander of the 31st Squadron when I was in Hawaii. And this was in about summer of 1940, before the war. Before we got into the war, the Japanese were beating things up out in the Pacific. The Germans had beating things up pretty well in Europe. But Hugh got us all together, enlisted man officers too, and he said, you know, there's going to be a war and we're going to get in it. And he says, this Army Air Corps is going to be 50 times as big as it is right now. He says, every one of you guys, and we were all lieutenants, he says, every one of you is going to be a colonel at the end of the war if you stay alive. He says, I'm putting in for a star myself. He was a captain by then. And he says, they haven't enlisted all of the master sergeants they're going to be yet. He says, every one of you enlisted men that's here now is going to make master sergeant before the war is over. So that was Hugh's view of where the Air Force was going to go and the Army Air Corps was going to go and what he saw in it.
What was the state of the art in the Air Corps, primarily the bomber force, prior to our entry into the war?
We had a few B-17s. I was flying B-17s, but up until 6 months before the war, we were flying B-18s, very primitive airplanes. And there were bomber units that were particularly in overseas. There were only 4 overseas stations: Panama, Alaska, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And the bomber units that were in those areas were all flying B-10s, B-12s. There were a few B-17s, but there were not an awful lot of them. And we were just getting ours in Hawaii at the time the war came in. All of our people were not checked out. In fact, the 11th Group, when the war came, had 3 squadrons of B-17s and 1 squadron that hadn't converted yet was still flying B-18s.
During our first conversation, you told me about your experience at Hickam Field. Would you tell me that story again?
I had gotten up to go out and get the morning paper. It was Sunday morning, about 7:30, 8 o'clock. We had quarters on the base, my wife and I did, and it was right close to the Pearl Harbor Channel. Hickam Field used to be part of Pearl Harbor, really. And I heard airplanes winding up in the power dives, and thought, well, the Navy's coming in, they're sending their dive bombers in from the carrier for the weekend. They'll all make their pass at Pearl Harbor, and then they'll land them at Ford Island. And then I heard them when they pulled out, and then I heard bombs going off. I thought, those aren't dead bombs, that's real bombing. I told my wife that something's going on out there, and I went to the window and looked out, and I could see Japanese torpedo bombers coming up right flat on the water with torpedoes hung under their bellies, and could see the old red meatball painted on the tails and the wingtips. So I told my wife, Lee, that this may sound silly, but those are Jap airplanes and they just bombed Pearl Harbor, and I've got to get down to the flight line. So I did. I put on my uniform over my pajamas and bedroom slippers and took off on a dead run for the flight line. And there was a lot to do. It didn't seem like much. We had to unlock all of the gun armament, issue sidearms and rifles to everybody, and what machine guns we had. The Japs were really banging away at our flight line. Airplanes burning all over the place. A lot had to be done. We wanted to taxi the airplanes out and disperse them because they'd been lined up wingtip to wingtip, where they made very beautiful targets. Had to pick up the wounded, and there were a lot of them, take them to the hospital, pick up the dead, find a place to put them in the hangars that we signed. Had to meet the 19th Group as they were coming in from the United States, and of course they had put all their guns, had shipped them over. The guns were not in the airplane, so there was no way that they could have protected themselves. They were trying to reduce the weight for the trip. One B-17 came in with the 19th Group, and I was just crossing the ramp, and the thing had 2 wheels shot out from under it, so it kind of skidded to a stop, and it was on fire in the radio compartment. And I ran out and looked up the pilot cockpit, and the pilot was a guy named Swenson, who had been in my lower class at flying school. And I said, "Hey, Swede, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Hey, what goes on here anyway?" So we got him out, and he had a couple of wounded on board. And I wanted to get the fire out in his radio compartment of this airplane so we could get it off of the runway so other airplanes could land. And we got one of these great big pushcart CO2 fire extinguishers from one of the hangars and rolled it on out there. And I climbed on up and through the pilot's windows over the wing and was going back through the bomb bay to the radio compartment. And the minute I turned that rascal on, the rubber of the nozzle rotted and I had CO2 sprayed all over my hand. And it froze my hand and I didn't realize it had been frozen. At any rate, we got the fire out and I climbed back down, and about that time an airplane went across Japanese airplanes, strafing and dropping fragmentation bombs. I felt a big bang and I was knocked out, and when I came to, the two guys that were with me, one of them was very badly wounded and the other one was dead. And I felt up to my head because I couldn't see out of that eye, blood running down, and I felt up with that frozen hand, and I felt like I had a hole in my head big enough to put my fist into. I thought, well, that's all she wrote. That's the end of the road. I thought, what can I do? Well, I'll just sit here and wait to die. So I hadn't seen any lightly wounded that day at all. I sat there and waited, and nothing seemed to happen. Then I felt up with the other hand and found out all I had was a little nick in my head. And feeling very foolish, I got up and went back to work. That was the morning. That was a morning I'll remember for the rest of my life. I went over the very next day with my general. I was in addition at that time to a couple of other jobs, including my assignment with the 31st Squadron. I was an aide to General Jacob Rudolph, who was commander of the bomb wing at Hickam Field. So he went over to see the admirals at Pearl Harbor, and I went with him. And we had a chance to see the tremendous damage that had been done along Battleship Row. The Arizona on the bottom, there's a place that we call Nevada Point because Nevada got underway and it was sinking faster than it was making headway, and they finally put it aground on a point halfway out Pearl Harbor Channel. It was shocking to my little second lieutenant eyes. I was down there at Marietta when they started drifting in, and of course it was a very secret base. They only had one B-29 there at the time, and it was locked up most of the time in the hangar. But we had the ramp full of B-26s because those were what we were flying, so that the guys who were getting ready to check out in the B-29s could get some tricycle landing gear experience. So these guys had hit the front gate, and of course they wouldn't let them on the base, and then they'd have them call me, and I'd come down and get them, and would drive them around the ramp and show them, hey, look at all these nice B-26s we've got here, and these are the things. And I could see they were getting madder and madder and madder at me all the time, like, why did I volunteer for this, and what did you get me into? And about the time they were ready to blow their stack and to tear me limb from limb, I'd say, let's go in the hangar here for a minute. And we'd step in there, and there's that great, big, beautiful YB sitting there smiling at us, and the world changed.